So good morning friends. I welcome you back in this class of video lecture. This is BA Part 2nd English Literature Paper 1 Poetry and Drama, and till now we were taking classes of MA. Today we take this second year class of literature, and today we come to a very famous poem written by Thomas Gray, and the title of the poem is Elegy written in a country churchyard. So please keep this full title in your memory, because sometimes in examination there occurs a question that write down the title of the elegy as prescribed in your course. So this is full title is Elegy written in a country churchyard, and this is a poem written by Thomas Gray. So before we come to the stanzas of the poem, first of all, you have to mention the school of Thomas Gray. Thomas Gray exactly does not belong to Romantic era, rather he is a harbinger of Romanticism. He is a precursor of Romanticism. So he belongs to the early 18th century literature of Europe, right? So first of all, age is clear. He belongs exactly not to Romantic era, but a era which was a bit earlier of Romanticism. That's why he is one of the precursors of Romanticism. This age is also known as the age of transition. You know, in social sciences, in humanities, in literatures, the periods are not shifted exactly as the period of clock shifts hour by hour, minute by minute, second by second. But it takes a lot of time as far as changes are concerned. So when between the two periods, when there is a gap, when there is a space, right? So that space and gap is called transition, right? So from one point of transition to that last point of transition, there is found a race of poets, a race of scholars, a race of thinkers who try to understand that some new change would occur in the field of knowledge. So they are able to recognize those changes, and they start acquiring, adopting those changes in their literatures. But at the same time, the features of the ancient age are also found in their poetry. They neither give up the ancient features and nor they fully adopt the coming features, the new features. So in a way, the balance between the two, the ancient one, the earlier one, and the new one. That's why it is called the transitional phase. So before we come to do the poem Elegy written in a country churchyard, first of all, we are supposed to understand the meaning of elegy. Number one, this should be the very first query on the part of students. What is an elegy? And as far as other literary devices, literary terms are concerned, here we suppose we are supposed to have some good books on literary terms. The first good book on terms is M.H. Abrams, The Glossary of Literary Terms, right? And the second extensive good book on terms is Dictionary of Terms and Phases. Dictionary of Literary Terms by J.A. Cudden. It is Penguin publication. So you should keep these two books with you as far as terms are concerned. So even before coming to the term elegy, our first and foremost assignment objective is to get acquainted with the age, with the 18th century age, right? So, what were the features of 18th century literature? What was poetry? What type of poetry was being composed in 18th century poetry? It was during the age of classicism that a gradual breakaway from existing literary tendencies had begun to manifest itself. Some poets of the age of classicism began to show an increasingly marked tendency to abandon the literary practices of the school of Pope and Johnson. In the beginning of the 18th century, this change was apparent amongst all poets, among all writers, that they started giving up the traits of classicism. They started giving up the literary features practiced by Pope and Johnson. Because Pope and Johnson were the renowned neoclassical poets, and in their opinion, poetry was an art in which one can attain perfection by constant study and by continuous practice. Poetry was considered to be a craft, to be a skill, to be an art. Whenever we talk of an art, we could think of acquiring perfection by practice. Practice leads you towards perfection in any art. For example, making a table, making a chair, right? Means anything which is full of which requires the skilled efforts on the part of artist. So same was equated with poetry, right? But in the 18th century, there came a time when writers started giving up, and they started to show an increasingly marked tendency to abandon the literary practices of the school of Pope and Johnson. In the works of these revolting poets could be seen a different kind of influence which inspired them to seek fresh subjects, fresh, fresh modes of feeling, expression, and form. And there appeared a race of poets who started seeking some new subjects, because almost all the neoclassical poets were writing on man, were writing on God, were writing on kings, on their affairs, on the conspiracy happened in the court, in the kingdom, related to other men. Neoclassical poetry is related to other men. It talks of someone else, as we could see this in the Rap of the Lock, written by Alexander Pope, and we could see this in Absalom and Achitophel, written by John Dryden. Right? So, seeking fresh subjects, fresh modes of feeling, expression, and form in neoclassical poetry, as we know, it is versification which is very much important. Only the versifiers are the poets, right? But in romantic poetry, there is no room for versification. It is everything sensitivity, sensibility, emotions, empathy, nature, imagination. Romantic poetry is completely different from neoclassical poetry. In romantic poetry, it is not other man, but it is man himself. In romantic poetry, it is not the external world important, but the world of oneself is important. In romantic poetry, it is imagination which is important, but in neoclassical poetry, it is facts that are important. So, there is a clear cut differentiation between these two eras, right? However, their works were not completely free from some conventions of the age, as I told you some minutes back, that these early 18th century poets were not completely away from the age long conventions. They completely couldn't give up, but they started adopting, accommodating new subjects, fresh subjects, new forms of expression, right? New modes of feeling. Therefore, two dominant characteristics coexist in the poetry of the age of transition. Therefore, we could come to this conclusion that we find two um, features which chiefly coexist in this age of transition, because you have to understand the word transition. Transit. What is transit? What is transition? These transitional phases are very significant in history, in culture, in society, in anthropology, and particularly in literature, because we are directly concerned with literature. Friends, transition means shifting from one point of mindset to another point of mindset, shifting from one ideology to another ideology, shifting from one set of norms, one set of precepts, ideals, practices to another set of practices, ideals, and norms. When we change our mindset, and you see, this change firstly takes place in mind. Firstly, we think of changing something, that we are going to think the subject matters. We are going to change the way how do we write poetry. The changes in the arena of, in the field of expression. So there are two characteristics which are dominant: persistence of some of the conventions and traditions of classical poetry, that is the artificial poetic diction, and second important is the stirrings of a new spirit, a new mode of thought or subject matter and form of expression. These are two characteristics which coexist in the poetry of transition. I think this introduction is quite sufficient for all of us, and from tomorrow onwards we take up this poem Elegy, written in a country churchyard, written by Thomas Gray. Thank you very much.